Thanks for your very nice presentation. I have two questions. The first question has to do with this idea that age commitments are not really subject to rational evaluation, but one could say, well, if they change, for instance, over time, one could think that one way which make people change to one to another kind of hinge commitment is some kind of rational reflection. So, and if that's not the case, how would you then think that people change their mind about certain hinge commitments? So that's the first question. And the second question is about the reflective part of your version of epistemic disjunctivism. So I'm more familiar with disjunctivism presented about perception. I don't know, people like Martin or something like that, and they are usually happy to assume that we don't really have this kind of reflective capacity, but we are just in no position to distinguish between hallucination or perceptions, for instance. So I think you usually disjunctivists accept that and they are fine with that. So I don't understand why do you need this further point in your own version of disjunctivism. So it's a kind of clarification question.
Excellent, thank you. So on the second point, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's this other view, what's called metaphysical disjunctivism. As it happens, I mean, I endorse both epistemological disjunctivism and metaphysical disjunctivism. What I was trying to do in the book, though, life is a lot easier for you if you endorse both. But what I wanted to do in the book was not, I didn't want to make the case for epistemological disjunctivism to be conditional upon the case for metaphysical disjunctivism. So that's why I don't appeal to it. Life's a lot easier if you have both. Like, for example, the distinguishability problem. You've got a more direct way of dealing with that, I think. But yeah, so, and then there's an interesting question which I talk a bit about in the book. To what extent are they logically distinct? And I say that they're sort of, dialectically speaking, they sit together. It's hard to motivate one without the other and vice versa. But it does seem at least possible to argue for one without the other. And indeed, there are people who do argue for one without the other. There's quite a lot of metaphysical disjunctivists who aren't epistemic disjunctivists. And there are a few epistemic disjunctivists who aren't metaphysical disjunctivists. I think Alan Miller probably falls into that category. So yeah, that's all that's going on there, really. And then with the change of hinges, yeah. So you're absolutely right that over time they change. And I think, as I was saying, the way in which they change is that your beliefs as a whole change. And I think this reflects the fact that, as it were, the change, as it were, never confronts the hinges directly on. I think what it does, it confronts all the other things. And then it gradually, as all the other things change, the hinges change with it. I think this actually reflects something important about what, in fact, takes place when there are quite entrenched disagreements, between people with very different commitments. In a sense, it's pointless going head-to-head, as it were, because that won't achieve anything. The best way to do it, you go for the periphery. That's how real change occurs. And I think, if you look at where there have been, apparently intractable disputes and then over time consensus has emerged, that's how it emerges. It emerges at the periphery, not at the fundamentals, as it were. And I think that's, and I think that's what I was saying about personal hinge commitments. That process, you can make sense then of the idea of the process being a rational process, even though it's not a process by which you're rationally evaluating the hinge commitments. That's the thought.
Yeah, thank you very much. There was a lot going on, of course. So let me focus on the Wittgensteinian issue, because I have a very different reading of what's going on there. But I'm not sure if it's really as different as I think it is. So, so first, I mean, in a certain sense, I do not think that Wittgenstein believes that the skeptic... I think Wittgenstein deals with the skeptic neither as a paradox nor as a position. Wittgensteinian undercutting, I think, consists in realizing that there's no paradox. So there's no skeptical paradox, and certainly he doesn't present a paradox anywhere. He deals with it in terms of, as you spelled out, in terms of a particular propositional attitude, doubt. He thinks skepticism has something to do with doubt, which hardly anyone does anymore, but I think for him the contrast is doubt certainty. And but nevertheless, of course, you're trying to bring to bear this stuff about the propositional attitudes to the paradox, which I think is not exactly in the Wittgensteinian spirit, but nevertheless, let's try to do this, and then how does it look? And here I'm wondering if, if undercutting is not a particular form of denying closure. So there might be different ways of denying closure. One is look for counterexamples, and the other one is would be undercutting. And undercutting would have the form, and here I'm just wondering if I understand you correctly. Undercutting, Wittgensteinian undercutting would have the form that, to claim that, closure, the principle looks good, but it's just heavily overgeneralized. Not because they're counterexamples, but because you think that you can quantify over all P and Q in your belief system, but then his strategy is to show that you have no idea what's in your belief box. So I think that Wittgenstein's strategy is something like the following. For reasons that he's giving, we cannot achieve the relevant form of overview over our belief box so as to even formulate these principles. So it's heavily anti-epistemological in my reading. So here I have sympathies with Michael Williams on detachment and generality. So I think Wittgenstein denies detachment and generality and probably thinks that principles like the principles that the bridging principles are just heavily overgeneralized. But that might be a particular way of denying closure without denying closure in the sense in which most people deny closure when they declare that denying closure. This is, a set of questions.
Yeah, excellent. That's really useful. Just put a little smiley face next to that question because I agree with a lot of that. On the first point, yeah, you're right. I mean, this is what I was getting at in terms of being undercutting. So it's not a bona fide paradox. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, in a sense, he's denying that it's a paradox. And then the other point about it, the generalization, I think that's right, but I think it's just normally, so I think it is really crucial though to recognize that it's not that we're adding any rider or anything to the closure principle. The closure principle is absolutely fine. But in a sense, we are denying something because we thought that the way it functioned, as it were, was different to how it in fact functions. Exactly. And I think that, so in that sense, it is a kind of, closure is restricted, but not because we've added any caveat to the principle, but just because we were misunderstanding the nature of our commitments and what they were and how they functioned. Yeah.
A brief, like when I think about Wittgenstein's strategy of nickel and diming the skeptic, so he's certainly a nickel and dimer, I think, and the way I look at it, it has something like the following shape, which seems to be in line with the family resemblance story from the investigation. So a skeptic might say something like this. Think of the case for ignorance argument, something like this. Certain things are flat, and but nothing's really perfectly flat. So there's really nothing flat. So that would be just the kind of confusion that Wittgenstein has in mind, and I think that he believes that we get entangled in principles like closure. And precisely because they have this form. So I would rather say, and I'm not sure if this is helpful at all, but I would, because you suggested that you called him a neo-Morean, meaning a non-traditional foundationalist, and I rather think of him as a non-traditional contextualist. But I'm not sure if this makes any difference, but that might be a different take on it. Then you can allow for, the different cultures and the differences,
Yeah, that's good. I mean, the reason why I sort of resist that is because of the problems that Williams gets into. I mean, I think Williams actually, he kind of embraces the epistemic relativism. This goes back to the other question. And I think this is something that Wittgenstein is worried about. Interestingly, those remarks on, what happens when the missionaries meet the natives, reasons come to an end. The worry is that basically reasons come to an end and then what's left? It's big sticks. That's how you persuade people. And I think he's in particular troubled by this because I think he's getting all these ideas from Newman. Yeah. Newman does very much embrace that kind of, he's very, very, very permissive of the scope of difference in hinge commitments that one would have. He doesn't call them the simple sense, as he calls them. But I think And Williams, of course, again, his contextualism meant to capture this thought, different contexts. But I want to actually emphasize the commonality. I think there's far less variability than meets the eye. I mean, really, what the way I'm trying to do this is sort of demystify it on that score. I mean, really, everyone has fundamental level, they have the same hinge commitments. That's the way I'm trying to put it. It's just the way that manifests itself is slightly different. There's one more thing I was going to say about this. Oh yeah, and the other thing, the other problem with contextualism is that, and this is, I think, the big mistake Williams does, is what we don't want to do is to sort of allow there to be a context in which the skeptic gets something right. I think that's one of the core mistakes Williams made. He says that the skeptic does discover something, but only under the conditions of philosophical reflection. But I think even by his own lights he shouldn't have said that, because the methodological necessities have to be true on his view, and of course, a priori they're false. But I think the idea that there is some skeptical context, but it's somehow restricted, I think that we should resist that. And I think once you lose that, a lot of the motivation for thinking of this as a contextualist view starts to dwindle.
I see, but that's what I intended when I said non-traditional context.
Yeah, maybe, okay.
I was thinking of something like, if I want to book a flight to New York, then it's a hinge proposition that no one has ever flown to the moon, which is why I would be really surprised if they asked me if I wanted to go via the moon. Whereas if I'm in the logics route, and someone would doubt whatever conjunction elimination, I would be really surprised.
Okay, I'd be fine with that.
That was the idea.
Thank you. So I'm just trying to get a better understanding of the steps of your Wittgensteinian reconstruction. So you want to say that we have these anti-skeptical hinge commitments that rule out radical skepticism, so brain and vat style skepticism. But we don't have to invoke the closure principle to do that. Rather, we get to this conclusion by denying that rational evaluation itself is global. And that entails saying that rational evaluation must be local. So I'm puzzled by the modal character of this must. You said it cannot be a form of psychological necessity. And I think you quoted Wittgenstein saying that we could not have been constituted differently. So I guess my question is simply, what is the character of this necessity? When you say rational evaluation must be local, but that's not a species of psychological necessity, what is it?
Yeah, so it's definitely not meant to be psychological. I mean, there's a way of reading Strawson on Wittgenstein where he takes it as being a psychological point. But I think it's stronger than that. I think he really does want to say that, as he puts it, it's a logical point. I mean, the very idea of a fully general rational evaluation simply makes no sense, simply incoherent. So I don't know what kind of necessity is that? I think Wittgenstein, it's a form of logical necessity. I mean, and then, well, maybe I'll let you come back to that and say, are you puzzled by that idea itself?
It occurred to me it might overlap in interesting ways to Andrea's talk when we're trying to conceive of the nature of knowledge and the certainty we can have for our capacity for knowledge. So I don't know how much more I have to say about that, but it occurred to me that you are invoking a form of certainty here that is not a product of rational evaluation. So it's a form of certainty regarding the local character of rational evaluation. And I guess it's just a different kind of certainty.
So, I mean, just be clear, it is psychologically necessary as well. What I'm saying is that it isn't just that. That's the claim, right? Because that makes it sound as if we could imagine different kinds of psychologies or something like that, or which function differently. Sorry, I got lost a bit on what was the point you wanted to make there? You were saying different kinds of certainty?
Well, yeah, it just occurred to me, like, obviously it cannot be a product of rational evaluation. Yeah. So it's not certainty that's going to be generated from that source. And yet it is a kind of certainty. I guess I'm just puzzled over what its nature is, whether it speaks to the sort of the constitution of being a finite rational evaluator and the certain limits that are imposed upon our constitution in that way.
Well, the trouble is, I think it's tempting to think of it recast it in those terms, but I think Wittgenstein actually really wants to resist that. It's not as if, if we were smarter, cleverer, made more inquiries, it's not as if there were beings out there that were cognitively superior to us, that they could have a system of rational evaluation which didn't have these optimal certainties in there. I mean, I think he wants to deny that that's not even possible either. So it's not. So it is tempting to think, well, it's just some feature of us and our limitations, our human predicament or something like that. It has to be so. I think that's not what he wants to say. It is a stronger point, even beings superior to us. Now, of course, God, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I find the very idea of God's knowledge mysterious anyway, because it seems to me knowledge involves abilities and things like that. So, but I don't know how that works in the case of an omniscient being. But I think maybe anything falls short of omniscient beings, but cognitively superior. The thought is this still applies to them.
Thanks.
I find it very interesting the distinction in both the relationship of the two kinds of sources of skepticism you want, and that's really intriguing enough. I'm trying to think about this. I mean, I think what I didn't quite understand was the relationship of the various kinds of hinges. I mean, so the idea of universality, if I understood it right, is the sorry, this is not going to be very organized, but you will be able to help me then. I mean, so if I say, if E, then I'm not a brain in the vet. This you explain this line of reasoning towards skepticism, then by contraposition, is fueled by the idea of universality of rational evaluation, which is something like that in every judgment I make, particular judgment, I've already brought to bear knowledge of thoughts of various kinds about how this kind of subject matter may be inquired into, what kinds of grounds may bear on it, and all this is sort of involved in it. And the idea of universality is the idea that it may be drawn into the very activity of inquiry in which I'm now engaged in this particular judgment, that there's nowhere where I can no limit I can put to it now. And now, so there are various propositions perhaps contained in it. The brain in the vet is one. So whenever I say, here's a chair, I'm sort of already thinking of myself in certain ways, namely in such a way that I'm not a brain in the vet, for example. I mean, that's one thing. Or I think of myself as a knower. So that is to say, that was your Überhinge in a way, right? I'm not radically mistaken or something like this. But yeah, I'm sorry, so I have this idea of myself as a knower, which is, as you said, not the same kind of act, which is the act of knowledge that there's a chair here. That's good, and said it's very difficult to sort of characterize this clearly, and I see this is what we want. So that's difficult. I'm not going to. But how does it translate into those personal ones? I mean, because in order to get to be confounded in my claim that there's so those personal ones interact with specific claims to knowledge, right, locally. Yeah. But you said the source of them. You said at a certain point. Yeah. I mean, you deployed the idea of source. They flow from or something like that.
Yeah.
Überhinge. How does it flow from there? How does that translate my idea of myself as a knower into?
Yeah. Okay. That's a good question. So, I think the reason why Wittgenstein was so struck by the Maury uncertainties, which are what I'm calling the personal hinges, is that so it's not. So, if you think about it, the idea of this overarching hinge commitment being essentially groundless, rationally groundless, that seems fairly plausible. How would you get rational grounds for that? And of course, the idea, the skeptical hypothesis, is that they're a philosophical construct, as it were, to call that into question. So, we recognise these things as something that arises in a philosophy seminar. The more uncertainties, though, they look like the sorts of things that ought to be arising in ordinary inquiries. The things that happen, there doesn't look like anything particularly philosophical about them. And I think what Wittgenstein's trying to say is actually that there is. I mean, he says these things lie apart from the route travelled by inquiry. So, what he means by that is, of course, we can imagine scenarios in which it's not a hinge for me, even that I've got two hands. If I was waking up after a car accident or something like that, I may well look to see whether my hands are there. It's not a hinge commitment then. But the thought is in normal conditions, that these commitments are playing this role, I think Wittgenstein saw that as kind of like a philosophical discovery, that they're not like ordinary commitments. There's something about it, I think he thinks there's something about our ordinary practice, as it were, which necessarily, as it were, always goes around them, And so you need a certain kind of philosophical inquiry to start thinking about them and start thinking about them as sort of objects of your knowing. How do they relate to the overarching commitment? Well, they relate just to the extent that these are the kinds of things, the kinds of commitments where if you're wrong, even though they're very specific in their content, they're the sorts of things, if you're wrong about this, you are radically and fundamentally mistaken. As it were, all bets are off. If I look for in normal circumstances, I look for hands and they're not there, then something dramatic, all bets are off, as it were. And I think that's how the one relates to the other. And it's kind of surprising fact that they function like that. Because there's lots of other things in the vicinity that don't function like that. I mean, if I look for my keys and they're not there, all bets aren't off. So I think that's the connection. This is when I was saying that if someone asked me, a child asked you got two hands, let's have a look. That just simply doesn't occur. I don't know if that's a help.
So as you say, I find myself being a knower precisely in those thoughts. When you so is it rather like the character of the personal proposition commitments as hinge resides in their being, as it were, the realization or something like that of the Überhinge. I mean, that what it means, as it were, to Überhinge manner, like thinking, I'm a knower.
Yeah.
What this means is to think various things in a specific manner, in the hinge manner.
I think it's the practical manifestation of the Überhinge commitment. So, that one acts in certain ways such that one doesn't inquire about whether you've got hands. One doesn't, the fact that one acts in such a way, this lies apart from the route travelled by inquiry, reveals the fact that one has this Überhinge commitment. I think that's the thought.
I have a question about your taxonomy of hinge commitments. So, if you it's okay. I talk very loud. It's all right. What made something an anti-skeptical hinge commitment? So the question goes from that I'm thinking that there are all sorts of things, there are all negative propositions to which I am committed to when I think about it, like I'm not a two-headed monster from the planet Zog, I'm not a zebra in the London Zoo, I'm not the Eiffel Tower. There are all sorts of things like that I know about myself that are the kinds of things that figure in skeptical arguments. So where would they go in your taxonomy?
So,
And in a way that I'm not a brain for that could be seen as just like one of those things that I take for granted about myself, but that has nothing particularly to do with skepticism.
yeah, it's a good question. This taxonomy might not be exhaustive, and of course, the final two categories might overlap in certain ways. But that's very interesting. So, when I was thinking of the skeptical hypotheses here, I was thinking of something which is designed to call into question the Überhinge commitment. So it has that feature of it. And also, of course, it's skeptical in the sense that it's meant to be something which where if you were in that case, you wouldn't be aware that you were in that case. So if you're a brain of that, then of course you carry on thinking that you're not a brain of that. It's a characteristic of it. Two-headed monster.
From the planet Zog. It's
Yeah.
But it's kind of used for another purpose. But it doesn't indicate, you know, there's a lot of things that you just take for granted about yourself. And they're all negative. I mean, well, no.
Yeah.
No, there's that. But then I would think that's more like a standard sort of hinge commitment.
Yeah.
But part of the reason that I'm asking the question is that it feeds into a larger question that I have, which is I'm not convinced that the closure and undetermination sources of skepticism really are different. And so I worry about that. And it has again to do with this idea about the negative propositions. So the way that the closure principle is working in the skeptical argument is that closure tells you that, for example, if you know you have two hands, then you know, and then come a bunch, that you know you're not the brain of the bat, you know you're not the zebra, you know you're not the Eiffel Tower, and so on. But it seems that you can move from that to underdetermination by saying something like, well, if I know I have hands, then that means that I can rule out a whole lot of propositions that are incompatible with my having hands. And then the intuition behind the underdetermination, you seem to be close to the intuition behind the underdetermination argument, because it seems like no matter how good your reasons are for believing that you have hands, surely they couldn't be enough to allow you to rule out all of this indefinite number of
Okay, good. So the first thing you said about Zog, I'm going to have to think about that. That's really interesting. I'm sure there's something to be said, but I'll need to think that's good. I'll need to complicate this taxonomy to get those in. Think about what their role is. This other point, it could be that maybe I misled a little bit in what I said. So I wasn't saying that there is no response to the skepticism available, which would deal with both problems simultaneously. And I think, actually, the view you just described, I mentioned it in passing in a different regard in the talk. It would be a kind of radical neo-Morianism. You know, where you said, no, I do have closure-type inference is perfectly fine. I do have rational ground knowledge, I'm not brain of that. And, of course, if I've got rational ground knowledge of E and I've got rational ground knowledge of not BIV, well, obviously I must have rationally favouring support, right? So you deal with undetermination as well. The worry about that kind of strategy is that it looks very revisionary. It looks like we're having to, it looks epistemically immodest for one thing. It doesn't seem to do justice to the strong pull we have, that there's something, there is something odd about the very idea of having rational ground knowledge that you're not a brain of that. So what I was trying to do, the thought is you can treat them as two distinct problems and then you have two distinct solutions. You can, as it were, avoid revisionism about either of them. So, yeah, but they're right. There will be stronger lines, and they will deal with both.
I'm worried about the idea that disjunctivism and the doctrine of hinge propositions are compatible. Yeah. One way, at least if we go with the McDowellian reading of disjunctivism, it seems to me that disjunctivism at least, or does not make, or is about to dissolve the need for any appeal to hinge propositions instead of, and thereby excluding them. Because I think that the disjunctivism needs to, at the end, claims that knowledge is rational all the way down. And hinge proposition, the doctrine of hinge proposition just seems to deny that. Mm-hmm. So disjunctivism, how can disjunctivism to be such a position? Because it requires to be a position that makes available an account of how it is possible that I know that I'm in the good case and not in the bad case, because otherwise, if that knowledge, if disjunctivism is not a position that can give us an account of that, it seems like a dogmatic answer to the skeptic. It's not a way of dissolving any skeptical problem, but you just say, well, disjunctivism is of no help if I am never able to know whether I'm on the good or bad side of the disjunct. So, and it seems to me that McDowell offers such an answer in saying what we need to challenge is, or put into question is that, I can only know that P by seeing that P if I also know that I see that P, but the only way as I can account for that is if I'm entitled to challenge the idea that reasons for knowledge must be available independently of that knowledge. And it seems to me if you challenge that idea, that reasons for knowledge need to be independently available from the knowledge for which they are reasons, then you are in a position to redescribe everything that Wittgenstein says in uncertainty, about uncertainty, as saying about knowledge. So the certainties that Wittgenstein is talking about in uncertainty is not subjective certainty, but is a certainty that is an expression of knowledge. So you could just replace the word certainty by knowledge in everything, and yeah.
Okay, good.
And then thereby, of course, then we know that I know that I'm not a brain in a weight because I see that there is a table, etc., and all that.
Okay, good, thanks. So, in the Disjunctivism book, I did actually offer a line which was, as I mentioned, as it were, disjunctivism all the way down on this rather skeptical problem. And so you do end up, you extract the consequence and say, well, we do know denials of these things. It's interesting that McDowell himself has a certain hesitation here. I mean, he gets challenged again and again to say this. Whenever the issue comes up, he says things like, well, you know, once I've shown this much, I don't need to go any further. You know, these remarks about how it's a now refusal to go and refusal to engage with it and so forth. So he obviously feels an awkwardness about extracting the consequence that you do know denials of skeptical hypotheses. But yes, I mean, that is one thing you could do. You could go the whole way. One other thing I was trying to highlight, though, is that you're not committed to, because we can make, there's a logical space between the idea of favouring epistemic support and then epistemic support which entails the denial of the alternative scenario. And once you recognise that there is that logical space, then the option opens up just to go for, you have a favouring support, but without thereby saying that you've got knowledge of the denial of the skeptical hypothesis. And I think the attraction of that is that you avoid the awkwardness of saying that you've got rationally grounded knowledge. Just like you avoid the awkwardness of saying, you know, you've got rationally grounded knowledge that you're not radically and fundamentally mistaken. There's something, I think Wittgenstein's right, there's something awkward about that, these wholesale rational evaluations. But yeah, I think if one found the Wittgensteinian stuff unsatisfying, then one option would be to be disjunctivist all the way down.
Thanks. Very interesting paper. I'm sort of puzzling over one component, and it's not really a puzzle about your presentation of Wittgenstein's position on these hinge propositions so much as a puzzle about, you know, whether his position is really tenable in the end, and whether he doesn't provide a lot of resources actually for questioning it himself in a certain way. You were talking interestingly about the background to uncertainty, you know, where this whole problematic comes from, and I would think that a very important part of it, and I'm not sure to what extent this is widely recognized and to what extent it's not, is that it's really a kind of extension, this project, in a certain way, of the account of grammar that he'd worked out mainly in the lectures and the Remarks and Foundations of Mathematics. So he's developed this conception of grammatical, let's call them sentences, propositions becomes problematic. Grammatical rules is a better characterization, as being the nature of mathematical and logical principles. And these have various interesting properties. He has the view that in a way, Mill was almost right about them, because what we do is we notice empirical regularities, and instead of doing a sort of just induction on them, we do induction plus. And the plus is hardening that inductively arrived at generalization So it becomes a rule that we will not allow to be overturned. So it then requires us to characterize new empirical cases in certain ways rather than others, and so on and so forth. And it's also meaning constituting. So even if in some sense we've already been able to notice that there were two pairs always making four things, once we have the rule, 2 + 2 is 4, we no longer quite mean the same by words like 2 and 4 as we did before. So it's meaning constitutive for the empirical claims as well as regulating which ones we make and which not. Now, if you transfer all of that as, I mean, if this is right that this sort of model lies behind the extension in uncertainty to what look like empirical propositions, like here's one and here's another, and the world existed long before my birth and so on, then you're going to have the same sort of thing he's going to have the same sort of thing in mind for these propositions. Now, here are a couple of problems that this might lead to. If the position is, and I found this very plausible as a reading, if the position is that what he says about these hinge propositions and uncertainty is supposed to preclude rational grounding or rational challenge, for that matter, against these principles, then you might have two worries, I think, here. One would be the idea of rational grounding is far too narrow here. That's to say, he's thinking of rational grounding as something like having a premise and another premise and then deducing a conclusion, where you need certain conditions to be met, like asymmetry in the epistemic strength of the premises to the advantage of the premises over the conclusions. You're clearly not going to have that with hinge propositions, right, as conclusions. You also are going to have to worry about a kind of implicit vicious circularity. If your empirical premises already presuppose the hinge principles for their very meanings, because they've been arrived at by presupposing those hinge propositions, then there's a kind of implicit vicious circularity in any attempt at such a proof. But if you think of rational grounding in a more liberal way, where it can include such things as coherence, more and less coherence, then it's not at all clear that you couldn't have better and worse grounded hinge propositions, right? 2 + 2 is 4 is very well grounded as a hinge proposition. 2 + 2 is 4 except for, 1 minute every Christmas morning at 7 a.m. is a little bit less well grounded. For a whole hour on Christmas morning from 7 a.m. is even a little bit less well grounded still, and so on and so forth. And so that's one thing, and the other thing is the other block here, of course, to thinking of this sort of rational grounding is this very strong sort of certainty that he thinks we have to have in order for these hinge propositions or grammatical propositions generally, logical, arithmetical, to play this meaning constitutive and regulating function role. And that just seems sort of rather implausible, right? I mean, why can't you be a Neurath and just sort of, say, well, in principle, I'm ready to change everything, anything, if I'm really pushed to do it. And so my thought is if you broaden the notion of establishing, grounding, what have you, if you question the strength of the certainty, then don't you indeed come up with a kind of conclusion, philosophically I mean, that he should really be saying that these principles are rationally groundable and rationally challengeable?
That's very helpful, thank you. There's a lot there. So you're absolutely right. That theme, the theme about treating these propositions as grammatical in some way, that's definitely an uncertainty. It crops up. I mean, although what to conclude from this is a bit difficult. I mean, at times he compares them. He says they function the same way, and some people take it literally and think they really are. This is a unified class. The hinges in there, plus the grammatical claims and so forth. So it's just a different kind of grammatical claim. I think what I'm trying to do is carve off the stuff about the structure of rational evaluation and keep it separate from that as a distinct thought. And I think that's the thought that he gets from Newman. I think that's the idea that's in the essay Date of a Grammar of Assent. And I think that's what's happening, I think, in Uncertainty is exploring that thought at the same time Because Newman also offers these more uncertainties. In fact, some of the examples crop up again. Like one of Newman's is that Britain is an island, for example. So he has these cases. I have two parents. That's one of Newman's examples, which crops up an uncertainty. So I think Wittgenstein sees a similarity between Newman's work and the more uncertainties, and I think he's also got this earlier theme that he's trying to connect all three together. A further complicating factor here, which relates to this first notebook, is that, of course, there's two mores. There's the more of the certainties, and there's the more of the anti-idealism, the proof. And, I mean, I think in the first notebook, really the issue is more idealism rather than skepticism. They're different kinds of challenges. And, of course, here, I think Wittgenstein's thought is that somehow the claims in play, the hinges, as it were, although I don't think they are, they're contentless, that there is a physical world and things like that. And so, again, you've got this other theme, this idea that some of these philosophical claims that we're trying to express, we just simply can't express. And so that's another reading you can get from uncertainty. You get a radical, if you fold it through, a radical context sensitivity about meaning, such that we can't even make sense of the hinge propositions, qua propositions, picking out a particular content or something like that. So there's all these different kinds of things in there, and what I'm trying to do, I mean, because they're unedited notebooks, who's to say, how Wittgenstein, I mean, he says himself, one of the last entries is something like, he says, I feel like I can't get to the beginning of this, and I don't think I will now. So even he recognises that it's muddled, there's too many things going on. Yeah, that's what he says, yeah. Yeah, I know. I'm plucking out this one particular theme, and I'm trying to keep it apart from these other themes as best as I can, because I think these other things raise further issues of their own. And I think it really is a separable thought. I mean, Newman doesn't have any of these other ideas in there. He just simply has this idea about rational evaluation essentially local, because we're obliged to have these certainties. Newman, interestingly, goes back to the first question, he sees this as a defense of religious belief. I mean, that's what he's doing. He's saying, people say religious belief has these groundless certainties at its core, and he says, well, yeah, all belief has groundless certainties at its core. It's like a parity argument. You can't criticise religious belief for this. It's in the nature of belief you have groundless certainty. And I think Wittgenstein, it may reflect his almost certain conversion to Catholicism at the end, but he's reading these Catholic works and he's trying to think through these issues. So yes, that's what I think about that. The reason stuff, I think Wittgenstein has in mind here is just something like there's something reasonable that one can cite. So not so much the premise conclusion, but just if challenged, you can cite something, and it's applicable. I think it is consistent with this view that everything, or at least almost everything, is up for grabs over the long term. So obviously the overarching hinge commitment isn't up for grabs, but over time the personal hinges can change, and they can change because your belief set can change. So I think actually what is immune to irrational change is just that core. It's not a broad class. That's the way I would think of it. And there was one other thing I was going to say, but oh yes. So the idea of rationally evaluating. So some hinge commitments being better than others from a rational point of view. That's an interesting idea. I mean, I think we'd want to, if we're going to make the stick, we have to cling to the idea that how we understand the hinge commitments, we can't start making assessments of that kind, because then it would start to unravel. I mean, I think the way Wittgenstein sees it is that there's this continuum, remember the example I gave in the talk was he talks about the planets, doubting there's planets and then doubting that the Earth exists, and how a radical shift has occurred going from the one to the other. But they look superficially like the very same kinds of doubts. I mean, you're just doubting about another planet that just happens to be the one you're on. And so you're going to have these penumbral cases where it might be difficult to judge, whether, presumably the thought would be you'll recognise it when you see it, but there might be cases which are perhaps more surprising than others, that they come out as hinge commitments. But certainly I think it had better not be the case that you can make rational evaluations of the kind of whether or not one set of hinge commitments is rationally better than another, because once you're doing that, you're rationally evaluating hinge commitments, and that's meant to not be possible. So I think that covers everything. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for talking.
Thanks very much.